So get this, Washington's own auto industry just formally warned the U.S. administration, do not fragment CUSMA. And the reason they gave this is the one that should stop anyone who still believes that this trade war is going well for the United States. Tariffs have already made it cheaper in specific and documented cases to import finished vehicles from overseas than to build them using North American supply chains.
And it didn't happen in isolation. Canada just posted a significant trade goods surplus. Energy exports up. Trade diversification showing real results in actual numbers. And Mexico's Secretary of Economy landed in Canada this week. Montreal and Toronto is where he'll be visiting. Direct business meetings, no Washington involvement at all.
Three things in the same window. The U.S. private sector is now fighting its own administration over a trade war. Canada's economic position has strengthened, and Canada and Mexico are building direct commercial relationships that have nothing to do with the United States. We're going to walk you through what all those three things tell you about who actually holds the leverage going into those formal CUSMA talks.
Let's start with the trade surplus because it reframes the whole picture, Dave. Canada's energy exports have been performing well. Global demand has elevated. Supply disruptions from other regions have made Canada a stable source in a market that is anything but stable.
A country posting a goods surplus is not a country scrambling for a lifeline. It's a country building economic breathing room. And what that does to the negotiation here is specific. It means Ottawa can say no without a catastrophic domestic downside. And that's what a surplus buys. It lengthens the runway for patience.
Ottawa has spent the last 18 months quietly building supply relationships with partners in Europe and Asia who need reliable long-term access to Canadian energy. Those conversations have accelerated because global instability has elevated the price of being a stable supplier. Canada? Well, we're that stable supplier right now.
So Canada enters formal CUSMA talks with a surplus on the books, deepening international energy relationships, and a prime minister who was explicit before the election and after it. No upfront concessions before negotiations formally begin. That is a negotiating position built on economic reality, not political posture.
Now, let's get into the auto industry story, because this is the one that should be generating far more coverage than it's getting.
Major North American auto groups went on record this week urging Washington do not split the CUSMA agreement. And we know why, right? The North American auto manufacturing model depends entirely on integrated cross-border supply chains. Components cross the Canada-US-Mexico border multiple times before a vehicle even exists. That integration is the reason that North American automakers are getting vocal.
But pull it apart with tariffs and you raise costs. However, one thing is for sure, tariffs have already made it cheaper in specific documented situations to import finished vehicles from overseas than to manufacture them using North American supply chains. The trade war was designed to protect American manufacturing, but American manufacturers are now saying it's damaging them.
And that internal contradiction is the one that Washington can't resolve cleanly. The administration wants CUSMA as a pressure instrument, but the private sector that CUSMA was designed to support is now formally asking for that pressure to stop right now. Now let's talk about the Mexico trade mission to Canada. Marcelo Ebrard is Mexico's Secretary of Economy, and he's in Montreal and Toronto this week for direct business meetings with Canadian counterparts. And he brings more than 240 Mexican companies for over 1,800 business meetings with Canadian firms and investors with him.
This follows a large Canadian trade mission to Mexico that happened earlier this year. Both countries are actively and deliberately building bilateral commercial relationships that bypass Washington as an intermediary.
Yeah, the sectors that they're expanding into, they're huge also. Critical minerals, clean technology, energy, advanced manufacturing. These are industries that both Canada and Mexico need inside their own supply chains, regardless of what the final CUSMA outcome looks like. So they are building bilateral resistance so that whatever Washington does or doesn't deliver, neither country is fully exposed.
The trade relationship between Canada and Mexico has historically run through American architecture almost by default. That default, it is changing.
And for good things, too. Mexico brings a different kind of leverage than Canada does. Manufacturing scale, a large industrial workforce, geographic position that connects North America to Latin American markets. And Canada, well, it brings energy security, critical minerals, and institutional stability. Washington, they need both of those things. And both of them are now coordinating at the economic and diplomatic level against a shared pressure point. That is a different negotiating reality than the one that existed even 18 months ago.
Now, here's a development that we think deserves the most attention in terms of where this goes long term. Trade diversification, building away from U.S. economic dependency. For years, that was a strategic objective governments announced in budget documents and trade conferences. What's different now is that it has moved from talk to actual commercial behavior.
Yeah, Canadian firms are building direct supply relationships in Europe, in Asia, and in Latin America. Mexican businesses are doing the exact same thing. The trade missions that have run this year have generated specific commercial contracts. Like we're talking about actual business relationships here with logistics infrastructure attached.
And once that infrastructure exists, Dave, it continues. A Canadian company that has spent 18 months building a supply chain that routes around the United States does not dismantle it when Washington softens its toe.
And this is the timeline problem that Washington consistently underestimates. The assumption built into the pressure campaign was that compliance would arrive before diversification became permanent. Well, the timeline for them, it ran the wrong way. The pressure has lasted long enough for diversification to actually take root. Now, it's not a threat Canada is holding, it's a commercial reality that Canada is already operating inside.
And that reality is not reversible on a political handshake. The window where Washington could have prevented the structural shift in Canada and Mexico's trade has already closed, proving why Trump has bankrupted so many companies. He has no idea what he's doing.
And then there's the domestic American political environment, which is something else we wanted to highlight here because it doesn't get talked about enough. The United States, to put it plainly, is in a pickle. Consumer costs are through the roof. Inflation hasn't resolved the way they thought it was going to. And of course, Trump's approval ratings, they're in the toilet. The problem is that Washington thought that it could absorb the political cost of the trade war while Canada and Mexico cracked under their economic pressure. Well, guess what? Canada didn't crack and Mexico didn't crack. The political cost is accumulating on both sides, but the asymmetry here is significant. Canada's government ran an election on holding his line and won a mandate. Washington has no equivalent to that.
Tanking approval numbers, cost of living skyrocketing, and now an industrial sector, including automotive, that is formally and publicly pushing back against the Trump strategy. Those are all eroding Washington's negotiation power going forward. The window for maximalist CUSMA demands is narrowing, not expanding.
Not where they thought they would be, is it? So, here's where the landscape actually stands today. Canada enters formal CUSMA talks with a good surplus, a strengthened energy position, a Mexico partnership that is operational and deepening. And the U.S. private sector, well, they're making Canada's economic argument for us.
So here's what we want to hear from you. The U.S. auto industry is now publicly on Canada's side of this argument. Does that change Washington's position before July 1st? Or does the administration ignore its own industries and force an annual review?
Drop your answer below because we read every single one of those comments and we love hearing from you.
And if this gave you something to think about, make sure to share it, like it, hype it, and hit subscribe if you haven't. And check out the pinned comment for the link to the A-Team and our merch store if you want to help this channel stay independent.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.